Perfect. Welcome everyone to the Edith Wheeler Memorial Library. This is the third installment of Arthur Gottlieb's lecture on the 20th Century by Decade Part 2. I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor for this program, the Friends of the Library. Now, without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Art Gottlieb.
Thank you. So today's program is going to be on the 1970s. And I put a lot of thought into how I was going to present this one today. So much of this decade now is really my full cognizance as a young adult. So I didn't want to just make it about the world according to Art Gottlieb in the 1970s. Yet at the same time, it's fascinating how it affected my thinking in so many ways as a young person. And the 1970s was a really pivotal time. It had, for me, as far as the trend of history is concerned, the 1950s, the 1960s was still a period specifically post-World War II. And the 70s was really the first breakaway decade that started a new era, right? In a sense, a transitional, in between the post-World War II years and what was going to become the new age, the new industrial age in the United States and the world, which was the digital age, right? The age of technology, home computers, and all the rest of that. And everything is starting to become, miniaturized to the point where we could carry around cell phones and things like that. So we have now the 1970s. Now, and once again, from my point of view as a young man, when the 1970s started, I was still in junior high school, and I graduated high school in 1975. So, there's the time span as far as that is concerned. And once again, much of the knowledge that I had personally actually came from just being a bug on the wall, so to speak, fly on the wall in my own home, where my older brother, who was 5 years older than me, well, just under 5 years older, but 5 years older operationally, he was in a different phase of his life, really, than I was. Of course, in 1970, the Vietnam War is still going on, and you had different things going around in the country, on television, etc. You all will remember the impact that student protests on campus were having at the time. So Kent State was something that was very, very dramatic, right? Televised a killing of one and or more in other instances of students protesting the Vietnam War, I think it was at that time, in that specific case. So it's really a clash, as I remember seeing it as a young person, between authority being wrong and or corrupt and a younger generation coming up that was going to expose that hypocrisy of this established older generation and then dispel the old way of doing things. In other words, war. Right now, we have a lot of that going on right now. As a matter of fact, it's a different time, a different era. It's got a different flavor, but what you see today regarding whether or not the United States should be in supporting Israel in its depending on your point of view, how you would phrase it, counteroffensive or offensive in Gaza, let alone our support in other wars around the world. In the early 1970s, what were we supporting and why were we supporting it? And was it the right thing to do? How many people had already been killed in Vietnam? And even by 1970 standards, Vietnam had been going on for some time, right? Lyndon Baines Johnson, who assumed the presidency upon the assassination of John F. Kennedy, had escalated the war by 1965 with active troops. And the question was this a just war? and how much were the American people lied to, you see, which was one of the things that marks the 1970s. 1970s, from my standpoint, one of the largest social and cultural shifts was going from the assumption that our government was good and benevolent and our institutions were good and they were benevolent and well-intentioned, even if mistakes were made, to they're lying to us and we don't trust them anymore. And power is being used at the misused at the highest places. From my assessment and how I wanted to approach this today, I think that that was a massive shift right at that point. Right, you had things that occurred. It was Vietnam for me, Exhibit A. Exhibit B for the 1970s was Watergate, right? So you have this person who was popular with particularly the Christian right, Richard Nixon, who unassailably was, won election and was considered a normal head of government. That entire image was shattered by Watergate and the reporting on Watergate. You have another kind of open transparency of people reporting on this. And it became quite the scandal, as you remember. I remember this, through the lens of a young person, but nevertheless, it was an earthquake in American politics. Then Nixon, of course, had to resign when he found out that he had no support left with the Republican Party, or he was going to face impeachment, and then replaced by the much maligned Gerald R. Ford. And one of the things I remember about Gerald R. Ford, another thing about the 1970s was, I remember the first generation of Saturday Night Live TV shows, right? With the original crew. And I thought it was just, was brilliant humor, I thought. And from the standpoint of a young person, it suited me because, it was irreverent and mocking and so many things that a young person would like to mock and see irreverent, certainly authority figures. And Gerald R. Ford was somebody who was he was always seen as a bumbling fool, tripping on everything and everything else like that. So the truth of the matter is that Gerald R. Ford, by the way, was a skilled athlete in his younger days and a naval veteran of World War II. In retrospect, I've done programs on Gerald R. Ford, and I've done programs on his speech to the nation about how our long national nightmare is over, if you remember that. And my audiences, who are typically, in senior living facilities, et cetera, over the age of 80, would tell me that they don't like Ford. And I asked them why they didn't like Ford. And it wasn't that they didn't like him. They didn't like the fact that he had pardoned Richard Nixon. Right. So that's something I learned from my audience, that they didn't like him because apparently they felt that Richard Nixon needed to be held more accountable than just be pardoned by the next president who was looking to make this whole thing go away, not because of his own political point of view. I think that Ford wanted us to start moving past all of this. Ford, the era where Ford was in, 1974-ish, 1975-ish, the country was in a wave of trying to move past two things. It was trying to move past Watergate and get it out of here as fast as possible. And it was trying to get out of Vietnam and get it out of here as fast as possible. And we've done a series on Vietnam here at the library on Zoom. And one of the things about the Vietnam War is, as it ended, The United States essentially just did whatever it could just to get the hell out of there. Um, and the money in Congress completely dried up because it was a political hot potato, and nobody wanted to support the South Vietnamese anymore, even though we weren't there and we promised them our support. And they would have probably been able to hold out a lot longer, if at all, against the North Vietnamese. But without our support, it was inevitable that the North Vietnamese would come in and do exactly which they did, which was to take Saigon and then reunify the country. And all of that, happened in 1975. And a question would be, had we had the commitment in Vietnam, would it have ended, from what my standpoint was, that it ended dishonorably. I remember firsthand that I felt kind of ashamed at the way American soldiers were treated during and after the war. And this was something very unique. From my perspective, having been influenced by, I don't know, my father was a veteran of the Korean War era, and he was a veteran, of course, in the Navy of World War II. So there was a certain amount of pride going on in my house about what military service meant, and whether or not that was a noble endeavor. But by the early 1970s, in 1975, certainly, when I became somebody who was graduating from high school, I heard my father say something I never thought I would hear. He says, "I don't know why anybody would join the military today." You see, and I never thought I would hear him say such a thing. But that's how much things had changed. And I had gone to the military recruiters myself and talked to them, and I wasn't particularly impressed. I mean, sure, I could have gotten in and all the rest of that easily, but I didn't want to. I didn't want to for two reasons. It was a matter of my being so pent up for so many years that I was inevitably going to wind up in Vietnam. And now I was like giving a reprieve from the governor from the electric chair once the war was over. And that was number one. And number two, I just thought I could fare better in the civilians field. And I didn't like what was going on in the military. There was a lot of drug use. Morale was very low. Morale was low in 1975, 76, and 77. And that hasn't been matched until today. Today, there is a low morale in the United States military, too. They're having a hard time reaching their recruiting goals. But the benchmark before that was exactly the period of time I'm talking about, the immediate post-Vietnam era. And having treated my first patients when I was going for a career in psychology, or the helping professions, if you will, was Vietnam veterans. And I did this in the 1980s and the 1990s particularly. And I interviewed hundreds of Vietnam veterans, and they suffered terribly from the notion that not only did they have the normal injuries mentally and emotionally that anyone would have, but with the added stigma that it was a bad war. It was something that the United States shouldn't have done. It was something that they shouldn't have done. It was something that they wish they were never part of. And so therefore, whatever sacrifice one can use as a rationalization to, well, at least this was a justified event, that didn't exist. It had the opposite stigma, that the whole thing was based on a lie and it was based on deception from the government. So these are the things that inform me about this particular period of time, from a professional standpoint and a personal standpoint. So at the beginning of the decade, I remember several things. Now, one of my favorite movies, right? I've seen it, I don't know, probably 20 times, is Apollo 13, right? I'm sure you've seen it. And the one with Tom Hanks, etc. And it is an excellent depiction of the early 1970s. As a matter of fact, it was 1970, if I'm not mistaken, where you had the Apollo moon mission, right? Every bit technically as significant as the first landing on the moon, without the panache of it being the first landing on the moon. But people were jaded by 1970. They were jaded by this whole business of us flying to the moon and landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to home. I mean, so you can see how fast something like that had faded into the background as far as its import. And of course, Apollo 13 only became important when it became a spectacle that we were going to lose three guys in space for the first time, you see, which, is more of a commentary on our own sense of sadistic voyeurism than anything else. Yeah, sadistic voyeurism. I'm sticking with that. And it's an excellent movie that depicts that. So that's the way the decade started. Another thing that we had in the early 1970s was, and this seemed very exotic to me at the time, was the opening of China, right? As if we opened China. And but that's what it seemed like. China might, for me in 1971, 72, as a young man, China might as well have been a different planet, let alone just another country. And it was a communist nation. It was very mysterious. It was closed. And then now you have, I remember if you remember this, one of the ways that this was popularized, I think, in the news, at least from my vantage point, was this whole thing about ping pong, right? That this cultural thing that the Chinese and us can kind of like agree upon was playing ping pong, and of course, behind the scenes, you had Richard Nixon and you had the venerable Henry Kissinger, who just passed, right? Henry Kissinger. Um, and we're going to open the world to China as far as trade was concerned, which required certain concessions, of course, most notably our position on Taiwan, etc., and which still, of course, has ramifications right to this moment. Not to say that we had the power to deter China in any way that or what their plans will be in the future. But it was really a turning point because China, communist China, was our adversary. It was our adversary because our ally was banished from China and sent packing off to the island of Formosa, otherwise known as Taiwan. And that's where our allegiances lay up until the opening of China. And it's interesting now, all of these decades later, the opening of China in the 1970s was the first decade where our manufacturing capacity started to go down, right? Not to say that our jobs were going to China in 1970, but they certainly were in 1980s and 1990s and the early 2000s, you see. So this thing with China became very, very important. But I think that from the United States point of view, not that I'm the spokesperson for the United States, but there's a certain kind of arrogance I think that the United States had, that it was always going to be the cultural and industrial leader of the world, and that somehow China was going to be this backwater thing. And maybe there was a bit of prejudice. I wouldn't say necessarily towards Asians, but just towards anybody who wasn't American. And I might be speaking from just things that I saw in my own sphere, but I've done enough history lessons to know that I think that that's probably true, right? And China, of course, I talk about this today when I do current events. I said I think the United States is arrogant because I mean, after all, the Arab world was one that preceded the Western Christian world, and so was China, right? Those two cultures had modern cultures before anybody else had them. And then they actually got pushed to the background by socio-economic, cultural forces, religious forces. And I think, who's to say that their time, or at least in their own minds, that they wouldn't wind up being back on top. We might be in the process of all of that now, as far as the Islamic world and the ancient Asian world. So once again, the pendulum swings. We are just in time right now. It's hard to see. It's like being in the forest, being very, very close to the trees. It's easier to look at something from 70 years in retrospect and say, oh, yeah, well, that's what happened. But when you're right in the middle of it, we look at historical trends and we see what trend are we in right now, and which way is something moving, and what are the things that are going to cloud our own objectivity about it. Right. That's the way I look at things. And I would like other people to look at things as a historian, to be as objective as possible. Now, this Watergate thing, I mean, boy, oh boy, that was major stuff. It was really major stuff. And we still look back to it today. I mean, that was the Pearl Harbor of what happens when a politician is corrupt, and it's how many times have you heard newspaper reporters and other political pundits talking about this or that or the other thing and saying, well, this is worse than Watergate. This is worse than Watergate. It's like the go-to, lodestar for measuring how bad or corrupt something could be, that it's a scandal, that they're lying to you, right? And that had a long effect. And I was talking about Vietnam too. It cannot be underestimated, the long shadow that Vietnam has had cast on this nation in ways that I described, as far as the effect it had on the United States military and morale. But what it really took a chunk out of Vietnam, it took a chunk out of what had existed without question to have existed before, which was the understanding that the United States was a just power and used its just power justly. That's what got hit. After that, everything became a point of speculation, a point of what if they lying to us? And we still live in that era right now. Now, we'll talk about this in a couple of weeks, when I do the 1990s, but when I was working with the military closely as a curator, historian, etc., it was during the 1990s, and it was a period right at the Persian Gulf War, the first Persian Gulf War, 1991. And that was a big deal before we went to war in the Persian Gulf in 1991, because all anybody could think of was, if the United States does something using military power, remember Vietnam. How do we know this isn't going to be another Vietnam? Vietnam, 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 Vietnam. You see, so the first Persian Gulf War was actually designed as kind of an anti-Vietnam, right? And we went into the first Gulf War with, number one, a definite goal. Number two, definite metrics to have met that goal. And number three, an exit plan. And that was three things, of course, that didn't exist in Vietnam. And the first Persian Gulf War was, in many ways, a healing gauze on top of Vietnam, and maybe starting a new era. Of course, that era was usurped by the War on Terror, right, which sent the pendulum swinging back in the other direction, and that was the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, right, which we'll talk about some other time. Now, it was just 2 years ago, I think it was, when we had our evacuation of Afghanistan. And many of the things that you saw on television, for those of us who were students of Vietnam, I mean, the references were unavoidable. You could not make them, about those people hanging off those gigantic Air Force aircraft that were flying out of Afghanistan. And for anybody who had a long enough memory or was old enough, you'll remember the scenes of people desperately trying to get on those Huey helicopters during the evacuation of Vietnam in Saigon. I mean, so that parallel is just etched. It can't be unetched. It is what it is. Um, that's how important that evacuation from Vietnam was. And it was kind of tragic. It was humiliating. And many people feel, not all people, but many people feel that there were elements of our evacuation from Afghanistan that shared similar kind of humiliating points. And, but that was, I had long memory of Vietnam, very, very long shadow, very long. Let me shift gears a little bit. Apollo 13, China, Kissinger, right? Let me shift gears to something else. Another major influence of the 1970s was the OPEC oil embargo. Does anybody remember that? Now, and this was for me, I have it from a point of view that was entirely selfish, self-serving, selfish, because I was looking forward to driving, right? I was looking forward to driving. It was for me, I kind of come from a car culture, and there's a lot of testosterone in my family. Two sons, my father, and driving a car was a rite of passage. And I felt as though the fact that there was no gas for me to go driving was somehow a personal affront, through the eyes of an immature young man. Um, but what a spectacle. I mean, what a spectacle, right? I remember my dad be over the kitchen table, being just incredulous that the price of gasoline had gone over $1, and it was a big deal. And cars back in those days were these behemoths too. They were these real, land cruisers, they were like these rolling aircraft carriers, if you remember. And my dad, who was always, if my father could do something with a deal under the table, he would always do it, right? That was part of his upbringing, where he was not part of the regular culture. He was part of the people who couldn't get what they wanted by legitimate means. So he and other people who felt like my father created this almost like black market for a number of things. Some of which I'm not going to mention to you here. But this particular case, this guy who had this gas station that my dad was, you know, tight with, they had this scam going that when you had the gasoline ration, you would bring your car to the gas station, and you make it seem like your car is going to be repaired, right? You're leaving there overnight because tomorrow they're going to, I don't know, give it a tune up. You see, but that was not the truth. The truth was that in the middle of the night, in the dark hours with the lights off, they were filling up the cars, you see, for people who were on the inside loop, right? Which my dad was, you see. And the next day you go and you pick up your car and nobody's the wiser. But, there were lines. You remember staying in lines for gasoline, and there were these long lines. And I was in traffic one day going in the opposite direction, and everything was clogged up because every gas station had a big long line on it. And this was going on into, certainly after I got my license, this was lasting into the mid to later 70s in some cases. And there was this guy from the gas station who was just walking down this line of cars. That was the line that was waiting to get gas. And if was just looking for a car, this guy with a sign, I didn't see what the sign said. And he found a Volvo station wagon, which happened to be the only car that had one of those windshield wipers on the back, which was unusual back in those days. And he took the sign and he put it behind the windshield wiper. And then as I was driving past slowly, I looked at it and it said last call. And then the guy who was waiting just as long as the guy in that Volvo, right behind him, right? In other words, the first car that couldn't get gas. He got out of this car and I thought he was going to kill this poor kid who was just told to go and slap this sign on somebody's car. You know, I mean, the kind of anger, the kind of today we would call it road rage, clearly. And, you know, I tell you, if that was me and I was waiting just as long and some arbitrary decision was made that the guy in front of me was the last guy who was going to get gas, I think that probably would have set me off too. You know, but this is something that was going on every day back in those days. Odd numbers on your license plates, even numbers on your license plates. And it started this whole international thing. And it really put another chip in American prestige. It wasn't that Vietnam was bad enough. But now you've got this group of countries from the Middle East, which are literally wagging the dog, right? It was the first time that the United States was in a position where it had to literally change its entire way of living based on what was perceived to be lesser nations, you see. And that was something that, particularly back in those days, it was the first time something like that had really ever happened. And there was a lot of pushback, you know. And I remember going over the going down over the Staten Island Ferry, or even the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. I don't remember. We were going to Jersey, I assume. I don't remember. And I saw in the Verrazano Narrows, which for those of you who don't know, is in between Staten Island and Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. There was tanker after tanker after tanker after tanker after tanker loaded, swinging at their hooks and waiting to get to New Jersey, right past Staten Island where the refineries were. So the question was always, and this was the big conspiracy, another conspiracy for us in the 1970s, was how much of this was actually happening, that it was really OPEC that was forcing this price thing to happen, right? From scarcity, right? Market scarcity. Or was it really the oil companies that were deliberately making it seem that there was a shortage when there wasn't a shortage, to finally drive the price of fuel up? You see, so now we are in the era of conspiracy theories, which we still are. And the plausibility, now that we know that it's possible for any entity to lie to us, lie right to our faces, it seemed completely plausible that this was some gigantic thing by the oil companies, our oil companies, American oil companies, making it seem as though the crisis was worse than it was, just so they could finally drive the price over $1 and then make more profit. You see. I just watched a movie with my wife. I waited till it was on and we could both see it. And it was called Golda. Maybe you've seen it. It's very well done, you know, and Helen Mirren, et cetera, just fabulous. Liev Schreiber as Kissinger. And of course, it's about the Yom Kippur War of 1973, right? And, you know, that was another thing going on. I mean, the Yom Kippur War was essentially launched to try to get back some of the losses of real estate that the Arabs felt that they had lost in the 1967 war. You see, so this was another surprise attack, and it was a surprise attack, of course, on the holiest day. and the Israelis were caught off guard, and then they got beat up a little bit and had to rally themselves, and it resulted in Anwar Sadat, I think it was, finally recognizing the state of Israel by saying Israel, just the word Israel, right? Now, I was listening to Iranian leaders yesterday, and they referred to Israel as the Zionist regime, I think, the Zionist something, the Zionist entity, the Zionist regime. But in other words, you're back to that now. Not that Iran has ever changed its position. So, in other words, Israel doesn't really have a right to exist. It's just a bunch of Zionist renegades that are trespassing on other people's land. So, but in 1973, this was very tense times, and for the Israelis, when I do this in some of my history lectures, I mean, the kind of notion that this is just something that can be mitigated as far as them being attacked by other forces or how they perceive they were being attacked, real or otherwise, on October 7th, that every single one of these things is a fight for their existence. And I can't sit here from where I am right now and say that it isn't, and that is something that, because I teach programs on the Holocaust, or any of you with an understanding of, or even personal recollections from that era, will understand that it's not something that regular people understand. If you have any kind of connection to what was really the greatest genocide in modern history, then the Jews not being able to have their own state means that they're going to be in a situation where they're going to have to be trusting another host country to protect them, which they vowed never to do again, right? Because obviously that didn't work. I'm talking about Germany, Austria, and Poland, obviously. So it's an interesting juncture we find ourselves in here. At this point, regarding 1973 and the Yom Kippur War and the efficacy of Israel and the legitimacy of Israel, etc. It seems like the pendulum is really turning back towards non-support, if there ever was majority support. Another story for another day. Something that I met a guy who was doing reporting. I think he worked for the New York Times when I worked at the Intrepid. And one of my colleagues looked at me and he says, "You know who that guy is? That's the guy who wrote The Killing Field." Right. At that time, in my own ignorance, I didn't know what that was. I forgot his name. I bet you one of you know his name. But upon doing some research, it was about the killing fields in Cambodia. And it was the Pol Pot regime right at the end of the Vietnam, right? And this was an atrocity. It was April 1975, right? You had the Phnom Penh, the communist government, Khmer Rouge, if you remember these names, right? And there was 3 million dead in this massive restructuring, and essentially this forced coup of the government. And finally, what happened was the Vietnamese actually took over. They intervened in Cambodia, neighboring Cambodia, and put an end to it in 1979. This is something that I don't really ever hear about getting talked about. And it's a long time ago already, 1975, isn't it? I wonder how many of you remember that Pol Pot. Culturally, the 1970s were important, very important. It was a transitional time. The 50s and the 60s, we talked about last time, where, the door got kicked down about cultural norms, the sexual revolution, the recreational use of drugs being, quasi-normalized, and the breaking of certain kind of traditions. I remember, people wearing long hair and things like that, men, oh, is that a boy or is it a girl? It was a big thing, and dressing in a certain way. And people who were the older generation were kind of aghast at this. It was like the end of society, which just made young people, including me to some degree, kind of like gleeful that we were making older people miserable, and but in the 1970s, those doors had already been kicked open, you see. So, young punks like me could walk into it without having to to do the kicking, and we just walked into the fact that the door was already open, right? The sexual revolution was in progress, and, at least for me, sexuality and the environment I was in and the availability of casual sex was much more available to people that were only slightly older than me in the 1970s, right? Probably fueled a little bit extra from this disinhibiting factors of smoking marijuana and things like that. All right. Um, and there were plenty of people who remembered the 50s and 60s or even the 40s. And it was two things. It was horrifying to see culture change so rapidly, but it was also liberating because people who remembered a more conservative culture or a more repressed culture, if you will, or a more traditional culture, if you will, were still young enough to take advantage of that sexual liberation. So there were a lot of people in their 40s in the 1970s who were like, hey, last stop for, you know, uh, kind of like a maybe sexual encounters in other regards. You know what I mean? I'm going to have a little bit of my own sexual liberation. I'm going to take advantage of this when I'm still young enough. There were a lot of things going on. And remember, if any of you remember a movie called, what was it called? It was called The Ice Storm. That's what it was called. And I think that it was very significant. And it took place actually or it's supposed to take place in New Canaan, right? When a lot of people had moved into these very modern, low, modular looking houses in the woods. And everybody was very, very like hip, you know, and it was very, very awkward because really they had been raised in a different era. And now here they are faced with this kind of liberalism, this libertinism. And the movie centered around this concept called a key party, right? If you remember this. And so you go into this party um and we're all very sophisticated, which means that we don't have the hang-ups of traditional morality anymore. That was something that belonged to our youths and our parents, right? Now we're sophisticated, right? So you threw your keys into this, I don't know, this fishbowl or whatever it was. And then on the way out, you fish for these keys, or somebody fishes for keys, and you wind up, whoever keys somebody winds up with, you're going home with their wife. See? So it was like this gigantic kind of swap thing, right? And we're all going to be comfortable with these polyamorous relationships. And it brings up a lot of things about the 1970s because that on one hand, it was like, woohoo, we don't have the hangups of our parents over our youth or what we were taught in the church or the synagogue about what is moral behavior. At the other hand, there seems to be some kind of unintended consequences with this sort of kind of unfettered behavior sexually, etc. You see? And this is important because by the end of the 1970s, the pendulum had swung completely back to a kind of religious moralism. And my thesis is that because of the libertine aspects of the 1970s had created what, for want of a better term, I'm going to call the Reagan Revolution, right? Which was already in play by late 1979. So, other movies, right? How many times have I seen this? The Godfather, right? It's not, I mean, it doesn't have a statement about, well, this is why this is significant because it was done in the 1970s. It's just a significant movie that was made in the 1970s. And then, of course, the best sequel of all time, The Godfather Part 2, and then The Godfather Part 3, which, as far as I'm concerned, sucked. Okay. Excuse me if you thought that The Godfather Part 3 was good. I didn't mean to insult you. All right. And another movie, and there are a million of them that I picked here because I think it's very, very significant as far as the culture of the 1970s and the questions resulting in the new freedom that people had sexually and otherwise, was Saturday Night Fever. Right now, Saturday Night Fever was good because you had this, this trim, taut John Travolta, of course, and he was, crazy dancer and all the rest of the actual storyline. And you've seen the movie, But for me, a critical piece of the movie, for me, was played by the part of, and I don't remember any of these people's names, was played by the part of John Travolta's older brother, right? Who was the special son in the family, right? Because he became what, like, or at least is portrayed to be by devout Catholics, that they had produced a priest, you see, which is going to grant you a special place in heaven or some such thing, right? And he had his picture up on the mantle, and comparison to that was John Travolta, who was interested in the way he looked, and he didn't seem to have the same kind of aspirations, or certainly not the respect from his parents that the older brother, the priest, did. Now, the important thing here is that the priest comes home, and it turns out he confesses that, he's kind of taken a hiatus from the priesthood because he's not sure that he wants to do that anymore. And he's going out with the John Travolta character. And now you got this priest who's on like a priest sabbatical. And he's out there, at one of these disco clubs. And what's happening here, maybe I'm sensitive to this because I'm a counselor, but you have one of the characters, the one who winds up killing himself at the end. He's trying to get the father's attention, the priest's attention. And he wants to talk, and he wants to say, look, he's trying to tell him something. He needs somebody to talk to. But the priest isn't listening because the priest is like, I'm on a sabbatical. I don't want to talk about this. And he rebuffs him, you see? So there's a number of things going on. The kind of pressure for the guy who wound up killing himself and everybody else in the movie to conform socially. And then you had the whole New York thing about, who's acting like trash and all the rest of that. But for me, the character of the priest was indicative of the entire decade. And it was here I had this thing that I believed in on traditionality. And now with this level, this world of liberalism around me, I'm questioning everything, right? Why can't I just go out and be as free as everyone else? So is anything going to be traditional anymore? Or is all of that now officially obsolete? And we are just in a new era of I am going to do what I want, and whatever the expectations are of me, or whatever perceived responsibilities there no longer exist. And now it was called the me generation for a reason. See, and that character in that movie was very, very representative of the major conflict in that era. I know for myself, having watched not only, things going on with my parents and their own, my father's own sense of trappedness and liberation, whatever it was for around women and all of the things that were happening around me. I kind of came to the conclusion by the late 1970s that if a person just goes and they sleeps with whoever they want, expecting there to be no consequences, that was complete folly. It was just complete folly. It broke people's hearts. It ruined people's relationships. And I don't care if the sex was good or not, it wasn't worth it. And that is my main recollection of the 1970s from being a personal witness to these things on many occasions. Um, and I was relatively restrained compared to some of the people I was around. So Godfather, Disco, Saturday Night Fever. Um, Now I want to talk about Jimmy Carter. Remember Jimmy Carter? Night. I mean, this first day you got the young guy, relatively young looking guy, right? And his wife, Rosalind, who was just passed. And I suppose it won't be long till Jimmy Carter passes. I think he's been in hospice for over a year, Jimmy Carter. You know, I mean, I think that historically, I didn't respect the policies of Jimmy Carter that much, but um, but what he did with the post presidency, I think, was enviable. Jimmy Carter was somebody who walked away, and he actually had an entire new persona as a former president, right? And he's there and building houses for Habitats for Humanity. I thought that was it just is like a regular guy there with a hammer and a tool belt, so I don't know. I respect that. I thought it was cool. I thought it was cool. And he was always a plain spoken guy. And he was considered himself um, a born again Christian, an evangelical, right? And, but he talked frankly. He talked about, how he had lust in his heart and that in his mind he commits adultery all the time and that he's a sinner. So whether you liked him or not, as far as his policies were concerned, I think he was honest. Now, as far as Jimmy Carter is concerned during his presidency, right, which is the point of this, you had this thing. I did this in a program once. It was called the Jimmy Carter Malaise Speech. Right. I don't know how many of you know what I'm talking about or even remember it. Right. I don't remember it in real time. I remember it only in historical context. And the Malaise speech, this was a different era in the United States, and it has to be put in context. Remember, I told you that the 1950s and the 1960s were like this big heyday for the US. We were still fresh with post World War II glory, and we can do no wrong, and we're righteous and we're mightful, and we have that we're the hegemonic power in Europe and the Pacific, as if World War II had just ended, right? The 1970s were different. In the 1970s, the United States was tumbling down from that high point. We were tumbling down from that high point, right? We were not the moral country. We did not use our power wisely. The government was perceived as questionably honest. And now we have to turn down our thermostats and wear a sweater, says Jimmy Carter, because we now have to do the right thing for the greater good. And we are in an energy crisis, and we're just going to have to start to suffer a little bit, maybe like other people in other countries have been suffering because they never had the abundance that we had, you see. And this was something that the United States never had to do before. And they didn't really like being lectured to either. And the notion was it was kind of like a crisis of identity. It's like, wait a minute. Aren't we the United States? And we still hear this now in political rhetoric all the time. There's a certain appetite for people. I just heard Joe Biden say, we're America. We can do anything that we set our minds to, and we're the United States of America. I heard many politicians say this, Democrat and Republican. And, so the notion is the thing is with Jimmy Carter is he was a little bit too honest. And he was there saying, look, um, we just gotta, we've got to change. We've just got to change, and we're using up too much energy, and we're using up too much of that. And although that may have been true, it just seemed like it came across as kind of like a defeatism, right? And this had never been discussed before because it never happened before. The United States had been on the up and up since Teddy Roosevelt's time. And now you got a president who's saying, yeah, we're gonna have to shut some of the lights off, and we're gonna have to put on a sweater, and we're gonna have to drive less. And I know that you bought that car and you like going 80 miles an hour on the highway, but guess what? Now the speed limit is 55, right? And that seemed somehow to a lot of people un-American. Still seems to some people un-American. All right. Now, on the highway now, I mean, I suppose that you find people who might be driving 55, but they're probably going to get run over practically or passed by every single other car that's on the road. I'm not taking a position here, right? As a matter of fact, I'm quite biased on it because, I am a notorious speed limit breaker. Okay. And I'll deny that, by the way. So the thing here is that look at cars, right? Car culture is a big deal. And this kind of reflected upon this. Now, like I said to you earlier, I grew up in a car, because my father was like a mechanical guy. He owned a hardware store. I like tools, I like equipment. I had a picture of a car on my, I have my 1969 Corvette in the garage, right? That I bought when I was 25. It was already 16 years old at the time. The car, that is. And I like cars. I'm like a car guy. And and in the 1960s was the heyday of these fast muscle cars. I had enough of them myself. And then but in the 1970s, and this was a good thing, we had the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and it was necessary and it was good. And restrictions, what happened was, and we're getting to the point, the restrictions that were being placed on automotive manufacturers to be able to reduce levels of emissions on engines, our car companies seem behind the eight ball on being able to have the technology or the desire to design better products. So you had engines that were designed in the 50s, right, and improved during the 1960s, 60s, that were now you had all of these accessories that were added to the engine to try and reduce the smog that was coming out of the engine. And all it did was it turned the engine into a dog, you see? And it was a nightmare. The cars were slow. And people still wanted the perception of bigger and fast cars, but they turned into a shadow of themselves. And performance cars were all but gone by 1973, 1974. They were just an entire genre had been just eclipsed by a new generation of cars, where the General Motors, for instance, was they just made everything smaller and cheaper and lighter, right? So their cars turned out to be kind of like garbage, They didn't really put a lot of design into trying to make a better product. They just came with a saw and they just chopped parts of things off just to try to make it lighter and cheaper. And production levels went down as far as quality is concerned. Um, and General Motors is an excellent example, all right, about that American arrogance, right? GM had corporate arrogance. And the corporate arrogance is they were the largest car company in the world, and we're going to be so for infinity. And what do we have to worry about? If we're going to start producing crap, then people are just going to have to buy crap, you see? And something started appearing on American roads in the 1970s that if anybody was watching, how many of you owned a Honda CVCC, right? An early Honda Civic, a little Japanese car, right? You see, you still have people like my dad around, right? Who were, my father, he hated Japanese cars or Japanese anything because one of his major points of identity, my father, like many World War II veterans from the Pacific, he was like, Jap cars. Well, I was trading bullets with those little bastards back on Luzon, which is in the Philippines, if you didn't know that. You see, and that was like the prevailing attitude, right? And of course, he used the word Jap, which is now considered derogatory. And I mean, who would buy something that wasn't American made? I had my father come to me, he's passed now, but my father looked at me and I had Japanese tires on my truck. He says, these aren't American tires, and that was a big deal to him. That was a big deal to him. And but the thing is now is that the Japanese were producing better equipment and they were producing efficient cars that were designed to be efficient. And they were now being imported here into the United States out of necessity because an American car that on a good day was getting 14 miles to the gallon, you can get a Honda CVCC, which would essentially be as reliable as you could possibly imagine, and then get 30 miles to the gallon or some such thing, maybe more. It broke the back of that stigma of having a Japanese car. And American manufacturers let it happen because they thought that they would never lose their position, you see? And that is, I can only crack that up to arrogance. And it's also true, as I already mentioned to you, that the quality level on American products, most notably General Motors at this particular time, went down steeply. So why would you get something that was a piece of crap that, from the standpoint of legacy, right? Because, well, I always bought Chevrolets. Well, you know what? This last Chevrolet is a piece of junk, okay? And the fit and finish are terrible, and everything's falling apart in your hands, right? And it's got parts that are mixed throughout the GM line and not really even Chevrolet parts, you see? So it was just another lie. It was another lie that you always bought Chevrolets because your father had a Chevrolet and you had this brand loyalty. And then meanwhile, GM was trying to pass it off to you as, yes, we'll take your money and here's your Chevrolet and thank you for shopping with us. But meanwhile, it was just some piece of junk, you see? So people kind of lost their another trust in some kind of a legacy product that was American. And then they just went and started buying Japanese stuff. And of course, then Toyota itself finally surpassed in the 1990s General Motors as the world's largest manufacturer, which to somebody like from my father's era would be unthinkable, right? And um, and it was the end. It was the end of an entire era of America is always going to be the number one supplier. We're always going to be perceived as the best. People are always going to buy our products. And they got blindsided by their own greed and arrogance and were surpassed. And it's just as simple as that. It's a famous corporate story. And they got surpassed and they deserve to be surpassed. You see, another story from the 1970s. I don't know how many of you remember this. Remember Lee Iacocca? Remember him? Right? So now you got Chrysler Corporation, which is on the verge of bankruptcy and had to ask the federal government for a loan, right? That never happened before, right? And, a Chrysler Corporation is hanging on by a thread. And Lee Iacocca comes in and he restructures and he puts together a platform of solid, basic cars that are going to be able to compete with the imports. And they were like, they were called the K cars. That was the name of the platform. And Dodge had one and Plymouth had one. And Chrysler had their own version of it too. And they were like these very basic, reliable cars. So they were going back and they were starting from scratch. And Lee Iacocca was responsible for, or at least he was given credit for, and it seems right to me, for actually saving Chrysler Corporation, right? And during that same period of time, American Motors had to merge with, I think it was Renault, right? But American Motors had some mini cars. They came out with this small car that was the wide small car. It was the Pacer, right? Which is now kind of like a cult classic because of Wayne's World and all the rest of that. And of course, the AMC Gremlin, right? Which is kind of like funny anytime I see an AMC Gremlin. Um, in the early 1970s, also saw the Ford Pinto, right? Known for exploding if you hit it in the back with another vehicle, and the Chevy Vega, right? So we were just taking these baby steps because we had to, because of this whole gas crisis thing and the fact that you had all of these much more sophisticated imports, you see. Now, we had smaller cars around before, smaller cars from Europe, like these little German cars and, certainly like British cars, because the British and other European nations always had to deal with smaller roads and higher gasoline, see. But the British cars, they were nowhere near as reliable as this new generation of Japanese cars. The Japanese cars was a whole nother breed. The Datsuns, right, before it was Nissan, right? Toyota and Honda revolutionized the entire industry because for the first time, you had a car that was like, it's like buying a refrigerator, right? You buy a refrigerator, you plug it in, and you don't think about it for like 20 years, right? How many things you have in your life that are like that? None. An average American car in 1970, right? By the time it had 45,000 miles on it, everything in it had to be rebuilt, right? You had to rebuild the whole suspension. You had to rebuild the exhaust system. It needed, you're on your third tune-up. The shock absorbers were shot. The tires, you were on your third set. It was it. And but my wife's Honda CRV has 225,000 miles on it right now, and it runs like new. See what I mean? So the Japanese gave us something new, and once again, it was a cultural thing from our own arrogance that we had literally been usurped. This is when this occurred in the 1970s. This was a time of we took a shot from Vietnam. We took a shot from Watergate. We took a shot from scandals, and we can't trust the government. We took a shot from the quality falling off from the top to the bottom on General Motors products and others. And now we suffered the reality that countries that we had contempt over, like the defeated Japan, are now surpassing us in technology and quality. That was the 1970s. That was the 1970s. And by the end of the decade, it got worse. It got worse. It got worse. Do you remember the Shah of Iran? Right? That's a whole story by itself, as you know. And the Shah of Iran, we had an Iranian revolution in 1979. And the Shah, I don't remember exactly what happened to him. He got exported out to, I think it was the US or something, for medical treatment. And then somebody who was in exile, the Ayatollah Khomeini, right, came back. He was hiding in exile in France, comes back, and declares Iran to be a theocratic autocracy, right? And they got rid of the United States because of its corruptness and its colonial interventionism, which it's hard to make the argument that isn't true, frankly, if you look at the Shah of Iran. And it also got rid of any kind of communist influences because communism was inherently godless, right? Which is obviously the opposite of a theocracy. And boom. And not only that, that was another black eye for the US because the Shah was our guy, you see. And then you had the hostages. This was the biggest spectacle on the way out of the 1970s was Jimmy Carter's final embarrassment. I forgot how many hostages there were. I had that written down here someplace. 66 diplomats, most of them were Americans. And we're held hostage for 444 days. And the United States, once again, is left being powerless over these Middle Eastern countries, which to us were these, practically third world nations, you see. So that was the way that decade went out. And it was, I remember that on the news. I mean, even as a young person, it was like, and it's day 200 and something of the hostage crisis, and then we had a secret operation, which two H-58 helicopters, I think they were, whatever. And then we were flying over the desert trying to have a rescue mission. Now, the United States, once again, was, even today, we're always saying to ourselves, the United States military is the best. The United States military is the best. We're the best. We're the best. We have the best equipment. And one of these helicopters crashes in the desert. It crashes in the desert. And I think the other one aborted. And the whole hostage thing was, the whole rescue mission was a debacle. And it was and then you have the victorious Iranians coming out and taking photographs of this heap of wreckage and everything else like that. It was just another visual black eye for the United States. That we can't even do that, and finally, 3 Mile. You remember 3 Mile Island? Right? Nuclear power is supposed to be something good. It's good and because we already have environmentalism now, right? So environmentalism means that, there's an awareness of, not polluting the planet. You see, so the 1970s also saw a lot of that, right? The 1970s, as far as environmentalism is concerned, and I'll get back to 3 Mile Island, was, for me, there was such a cultural thing, a shift with environmentalism, because as a reaction to people who were baby boomers, older baby boomers, I'm like a young baby boomer, the older baby boomers reacting to their parents and to the kind of packaged, highly processed, full of artificial ingredients, convenience foods as being, oh, who the hell knows what this is in this stuff? And maybe we don't want our vegetables genetically modified and all the rest of this. That all started in the 1960s, of course, and people eating healthfully. And, so there was also a cultural aspect of it, as I told you, generationally, whereas we're not doing what you're doing because this is all bad for you and everything else like that, right? And there was a lot of that going on even in my house, certainly with my older brother, right, who came, to a point of like completely holistic lifestyle, like totally holistic lifestyle, right? Now, the truth of the matter is it's hard to look at somebody like my parents, right? My mother, who's 96 years old right now, who I just spoke to, right, who still has all her marbles, as much as she ever had her marbles, that is, right? Sorry, Mom. But the thing is that, it's hard to look at somebody who's going to be 97 years old and say, well, you see, I told you not to eat that. That really messed you up, because obviously nothing messed her up. So, but anyway, when you're a young person, you're looking to something to identify yourself against that generation. Here, that was a big hole. We're going to eat natural products that don't have this and don't have that. And remember, there was a lot of hippies around. There was a lot of hippies around in the 1970s, certainly around where I was. And you had these hippie women and hippie lifestyles, and it was really like this kind of free range sort of existence, as much as you could have a free range existence. And people were trying to sustain themselves, and there were a lot of euphemisms like, well, we're smoking pot because this is all natural, and all the rest of that, as if there's no carcinogenic factors in that. That's another discussion that even is coming up today, where it's like, now that pot is legalized, did we just create another lung epidemic? Right, another story for another day. However, back in those days, it was part of the culture, right? Because it was natural. That was well, I'll call it a rationalization. That's what I'll call it. And so, of course, you don't want to pollute the earth, but what about nuclear energy? Well, nuclear energy seemed okay. I mean, it doesn't use up any oxygen, and it doesn't put out any pollutants. I mean, sure, you got to put the used nuclear fuel someplace, and we'll send that out to some mountain in Nevada, right? And we'll, shove it in there, and until some other civilization rolls, you know. But then you had 3 Mile Island, 1979. Yeah, 1979. And then that was like this, we had this potential meltdown of a reactor. And the problem is that radioactive gases were released into the atmosphere, right? And it was technically user error, but who cares? This was all we needed. And then it became no nukes, right? No nukes, no nukes after. Now, I use no nukes in another very selfish way, right? Because there were a lot of these concerts that were being put on in the late 1970s and early 1980s that were no nukes concerts, right? And I went to I went to concerts all the time, and it was a great way to get girls to go with me, because obviously I had a heart, because they thought I was going because I liked the idea that I was going to save the environment, because I was supporting no nukes. And the truth of the matter is that I just wanted to, go with the girl, right? For other potential situations that may result from that date. So the thing is that no nukes was a phenomenon. 1979 into the early 1980s. And all of a sudden, it was like everything nuclear had to be shut down immediately, right? Everything nuclear had to be shut down. It's a tremendous hazard. It's going to kill all of us. And, we should just turn all the lights off and then eat green sprouts or whatever else that grows naturally, right? And to some degree, we're still having the discussion today about nuclear energy, because certainly we're in a position of time that is, like part two of the energy revolution. And now it's not because we don't have enough energy that we have to find alternative energy means to generate electricity. It is because now, under the moniker of global warming, right, and climate change, that we need to actually have non-fossil fuel burning apparatus to generate power, right? And different modes of transportation that doesn't burn hydrocarbons. And so therefore, the question of nuclear energy is right back with us. Is this a viable alternative, or is it still, as was considered from 3 Mile Island onward, just too dangerous? Just too dangerous. And when I was working in Manhattan in the 1990s on the waterfront, we couldn't have, when I was arranging with the Navy, not me personally, but me and many other people arranging with the Navy, what ships were going to be visiting New York Harbor for Fleet Week every year. They couldn't be a nuclear ship, right? So in other words, you couldn't have a nuclear submarine, you couldn't have a nuclear aircraft carrier, right? And all of our big aircraft carriers, not all of them, most of them were nuclear, right? So we had to arrange for conventionally powered vessels to visit New York Harbor because in an effort to, some would say that this is mere posturing. Others would say it was a practical decision. In New York City and the waterways thereof, you cannot have a vessel that's nuclear powered, right? Because God knows what will happen and it'll create a massive catastrophe should there be a nuclear leak or something like that, you see? And that's strictly a result of what happened at 3 Mile Island, you see? And I remember the furor, living in Westchester County at the time when the Indian Head power plant was going to be created and built and put online and then finally taken offline. What a furor that was is that it's just, you can't have nuclear power. You just can't have it, you know. So I don't know. But that was another thing that happened in the 1970s that really, really had a massive, massive impact that's still with us today. Um, there are many other things that happened in the 1970s. I hit some of the things that I felt as though were important points. Um, Another point of the 1970s that was a result of the 1960s and the sexual revolution, and was that you had a lot of women for the first time that were in positions of real power, real power, right? Not just, go get me a cup of coffee and a little pat on the backside, that kind of Mad Men 1960s stuff. But you had Margaret Thatcher become the first female prime minister of Great Britain. You had other world leaders in places like Argentina, et cetera, that had female leaders. You had women who were in real positions of power in corporations. And this is the first time this happened in the 1970s. Um, and that was, of course, as a result of what happened in the 1960s, right? It seems frivolous compared to some of the things we talked about, but you see certain kinds of women in positions where they had central roles in television shows, right? Like, I remember when I was a kid, I used to watch, what was it called? The Dick Van Dyke Show, right? And it had Mary Tyler Moore, right? Mary Tyler Moore. And Mary Tyler Moore, even in, during the Dick Van Dyke Show, she had told the producers way back then, she says, listen, I'm only doing this program under one condition here. I am not going to be the normal kind of housewife that you see on the era TV shows where I'm wearing like this, I don't know what they call them, a house frock or, an apron, or whatever women wear when they're going around, cleaning the drapes in the toilets and vacuuming the floor, right? She says, I'm going to be dressed fashionably and I'm not going to look like I'm a servant in the house. And that was kind of a breakthrough for her and good on her for advocating for herself in that regard. But my point is that in the 1960s, like one of the first, if not the first, show that had a real female character as the star was Mary Tyler Moore, right? I forgot the name of the show, Mary Tyler Moore Show. That was a long stretch, wasn't it? Mary Tyler Moore Show. And she was, this young woman and she was not married. And she, see, this was a big deal to have a woman who's living alone, right? Who's not married because she doesn't need a husband. That was breaking a barrier even back in those days, you see? And there she was, and she was the main character. And of course, there was a few spin-offs of that. I think it was, what was it, Rhoda and one other, I forgot the name of it, right? And so shows like that were a big deal. I remember some of the other TV shows during that era that you could not show today. I mean, ever since 2020 with George Floyd, right? We had such a remarkable cultural shift at that moment only a few years ago, because in immediate post George Floyd situation. And what I'm thinking about is the Dukes of Hazzard, right? The Dukes of Hazzard, which was this silly show from the 1970s where they had this orange Dodge Charger and these two good old boys down in the South, and they were always running from these wacky sheriffs and things like that. But the top of the car had, right, the stars and bars of the Confederate flag, which, immediately in the year 2020, you had to get rid of all your Dukes of Hazzard memorabilia. Dukes of Hazzard that was running on reruns had to immediately be taken off the show, off the TV, because anything that had any reference to any positive connotation having to do with the Confederacy, even in Confederate legacy, had to immediately be scrubbed, canceled. You see, but that was another program from the 1970s, and there were many more. Not the least of which was All in the Family, which was another groundbreaking show. Talked about cultural and social and intergenerational issues of the time. And Sanford and Sons, right? So now you have other shows that actually have Black main characters, right? So the Black character isn't the secondary person. They're the actual primary person in television shows. These were all things that happened during the 1970s. Anyway, boy, that hour and a half goes by fast. I so enjoy doing this with you, and it's a privilege to spend this time. I want to thank you for signing up for my program. I look forward to seeing you next time, where this is the end of the 1970s. We'll be doing the 1980s, right? Technological revolution, the rise of neoconservatism, etc. Thank you very, very much. Where's our host? Okay, well, she's not here, so I guess we should just end it,
No, I'm
right?
here. I'm here.
Okay. Did that sound true terminal? I guess we should just end it, you know?
No, I'm here. Oh, well, thank you again so much.
Wait, were you sleeping? It's okay, you can tell.
No, no, no. I was finishing up a task on my end. But yes, thank you so much for joining us today. Anyone have any questions or any comments for today's session on the 1970s? Thank you for bringing up the shows, by the way. I couldn't remember the other ones that Mary Tyler Moore. I know that Maude and other ones had spin-offs.
Wasn't it Phyllis?
Okay.
Yeah.
The one that Betty White played, right? Or no, she played a different role.
No, that was Golden Girls.
Oh, yeah. But it was like all kind of connected because they were under Norman Lear.
No, there are 100 of them.
Oh, millions. Anyway.
And I spared you all the stories of how good I looked in bell bottoms and polyester shirts, right? Back when I had like a 30-inch waist. I was hot, man. I had my shirt open. You could see like my 3 chest hairs. It was cool.
It was cool, man, cool. Well, thank you so much again. I just want to let everyone know that our next session will be on April 17th at 2 p.m. And if you missed any of the previous sessions, they are available on our YouTube page. Thank you, Art, again for your time. And thank you to everyone for coming. And we will see you all very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.